The back wheels lost traction, and in a fraction of a second, the car whipped around, sending him slamming into the concrete barrier. The entire right side of the car crushed in on itself, and as debris littered the track and the dust from the crash began to settle, Nelson Piquet Jr. sat in the driver's seat in a shaken silence, and all he could think of was what his team manager, Flavio Briatore, would say. This felt like the final moment in a long string of missteps. His rookie season had been riddled with errors and underperformance. He was constantly living under the threat of being dropped from the team, and this race felt like his last chance to prove his value to a team that demanded everything from him. He stepped out onto the wreck, under the glow of the track lights, and he made his way back to the pit wall to debrief with the rest of the Renault team. As he walked, the safety car emerged with its flashing lights, and the other racers were brought to a slow crawl. The pit lane was now closed, under a strange rule at the time that prevented cars from entering the pits the moment a safety car was deployed. But thankfully, Nelson's teammate, Fernando Alonso, had just refueled, so the crash ended up being pretty convenient for the team. When Nelson made it back to the pit wall, he locked eyes with Briatore. Usually, after a colossal failure like this, Briatore would be furious, but instead, he gave a glance, a subtle nod, and brought his focus back to the monitor to continue checking in with Alonso. Nelson felt sick to his stomach, and he retreated to a chair, preparing to face the media. He had no idea whether he still had a job or not. Briatore had been deliberately not telling him whether his contract would be getting renewed for the following season. Nelson wasn't sure whether Briatore hadn't decided yet, or whether he was just holding it over him as a way to control him. Either way, the pressure was clearly getting to Nelson Piquet Jr. And it wasn't just the pressure of keeping his job either. It was the pressure of living up to his family name. His father, Nelson Piquet Sr., was a legend in the sport, a 3-time Formula One world champion. Even in his earliest days tearing around go-kart tracks, Nelson Jr. felt the heavy burden of expectation on his shoulders. However, despite the pressure, Nelson still performed well, incredibly well, in fact. He blazed a trail through the junior formulas, winning the British Formula 3 championship, and then finishing as the runner-up to a young Lewis Hamilton in the fiercely contested 2006 GP2 series. So when he signed with the Renault F1 team for the 2008 season, it felt like the culmination of a lifelong dream. He was finally here, ready to carve his own legacy and to prove he was more than just his father's son. He imagined a future of victories, championships, and a career that would make the Piquet name proud once more. But life in the Renault team wasn't anything like he'd imagined. On the day Nelson met the Renault team principal, he found himself in an unexpectedly vulnerable position. Flavio Briatore wasn't just his team principal at Renault, he was also Nelson's personal manager. And unlike every team Nelson raced in prior, Briatore didn't give a single shit about the Piquet name. After all, this was a man who had discovered the legendary Michael Schumacher and had guided Fernando Alonso to 2 world titles. Briatore was also the personal manager for at least 6 other drivers on the grid at the time, so to him, Nelson wasn't anything special, just another number on the payroll. Plus, Briatore's management style wasn't about nurturing talent, it was more about control. Briatore would publicly berate Nelson, undermining his confidence and playing psychological games that left Nelson feeling isolated and worthless. Pretty quickly, Nelson started feeling less like a revered competitor and more like a dog on a leash. As the 2008 season wore on, Briatore refused to confirm whether Nelson's contract would be renewed for 2009. He just dangled Nelson's future just out of reach as a constant, unspoken threat, and Nelson felt powerless. And unfortunately, Nelson's rookie season was littered with mistakes, crashes, and equipment failure. Just about the only glimmer of hope was in Germany, when, by sheer luck, he managed to squeak out a second-place finish. For the Renault team, the 2008 season had been a disaster. After winning back-to-back championships in 2005 and 2006, the team had essentially fallen off a cliff, and the design of the car they had this season just didn't seem to be competitive. Fernando Alonso was feeling the heat most of all. He was a double world champion, one of the greatest drivers of his generation, yet he hadn't stood on a podium all year. For Alonso, Briatore, and the entire Renault organization, they needed a result. Something, anything to salvage their season and to justify their existence. And they thought, what better place to make a comeback than at the historic Singapore Grand Prix? For the first time ever, Formula One was racing at night. The newly built Marina Bay Street Circuit was prepared and lit up for the inaugural race through the heart of the city. In the hours leading up to the race, Nelson could feel the tension in the Renault garage, and he saw a look in Briatore's eyes that he'd never seen before. The usual arrogance and swagger were gone, replaced by a raw, naked nervousness. The master puppeteer looked genuinely scared, and it was then that Nelson was summoned. Not to the public debriefing room, but to a small, private office behind the garage. A secret meeting, just him, Briatore, and the team's executive director of engineering, Pat Simmons. Nelson felt his heart pounding in his chest. Pat spoke first. "Look," he began, "both cars, you and Alonso, are at the back of the grid. We're in a situation where we're not going to get anywhere in this race unless something extraordinary happens." Briatore nodded in agreement. "It would be a disaster for the team unless something extraordinary happened," he added. Nelson was confused. He wasn't sure what they were implying, until Pat elaborated. He looked Nelson directly in the eye and he asked if he would be willing to sacrifice his own race for the sake of the team by causing a safety car. And with those words, Nelson's mind was thrown back 10 weeks earlier, to the lucky second-place finish he squeaked out at the German Grand Prix at Hockenheim. He had been running a lonely race in the midfield. Then, on lap 36, Toyota suffered a suspension failure and violently crashed, bringing out the safety car. Nelson, who by sheer luck had pitted for fuel just 2 laps earlier, was suddenly gifted an incredible advantage. The leaders had been trapped, unable to pit under the 2008 regulations. He leapfrogged the field, gaining 11 places in an instant and rewarding him with his first ever F1 podium finish. When Nelson's focus came back to the room, the sinister reality of the plot unsettled him. They wanted him to crash on purpose. The plan was unnervingly precise. Pat Simmons, being the brilliant engineer he was, had already worked out the details. He unrolled a track map and pointed to a specific corner, the exit of turn 17. As Simmons explained, there were no cranes or access roads nearby. Any crash there would require the safety car to be deployed for a long period to allow marshals on the track to clear the wreckage. It was the perfect location. Nelson sat there feeling trapped. He felt the walls of the cramped office closing in. He knew he should say no, but he also knew what was at stake. Reading between the lines, it didn't feel like a request. It felt like a loyalty test. Comply and he might have a future. Refuse, and he's finished. So, Nelson reluctantly agreed. And hours later, there he was on the starting grid, about to commit the ultimate sporting sin of cheating. What would his father think? Alonso's car was given a light fuel load. It was enough to reach lap 12, but not much more. And so, on lap 12, right on schedule, Alonso drove into the pits. He refueled with enough to get him to the end of the race, and he rejoined near the back of the pack. The first domino had fallen. Meanwhile, the race leaders Felipe Massa in his Ferrari and Lewis Hamilton in his McLaren, locked in a fierce battle for the World Championship, were running much longer first stints, their cars heavy with fuel, completely oblivious to the trap that was about to be sprung. On laps 13 and 14, Nelson's terror grew with every corner. He was almost more nervous about missing the mark for the team than he was worried about his own safety. With each lap he completed, he tried to see the lap board, but the nighttime track was so dark he could barely see anything. He kept calling the team over his radio, frantically asking what lap he was in, until he reached lap 14, turn 16. This was it. He lined the car up and accelerated hard towards the apex of 17. And as he lurched around the corner, the back wheel slipped, the car snapped sideways, and he steered it into the wall. For a moment, Nelson sat there, the shame in his eyes hidden behind his visor as he slumped into the cockpit of the ruined car, sick to his stomach. The amber lights flashed and the safety car was deployed, exactly as planned. The pit lane was immediately closed, and the race leaders, Massa, Hamilton, and the others, were forced to crawl around behind the safety car, unable to make their scheduled stops. When the pit lane finally opened, chaos erupted. Ferrari, in a state of panic, rushed Massa's stop. In the rush, the pit crew released him with the fuel hose still attached to the car. The long, heavy hose was ripped from its frame, spraying fuel and knocking a mechanic to the ground. Massa was forced to stop at the end of the pit lane while his crew ran down to manually remove the hose. He was penalised for the unsafe release, and he would go on to finish 13th, scoring no points. Of course, Renault were now on easy street. Fernando Alonso, having already made his perfectly timed pit stop, sailed past the carnage and crossed the finish line in first place. It was Renault's first victory in almost 2 years. To Briatore and Simmons, it was the perfect crime. They thought they had manipulated a Formula One race and gotten away with it. However, in the high-tech, data-driven world of the F1 paddock, the crash immediately raised red flags. Rob Smedley, Felipe Massa's highly experienced race engineer at Ferrari, could tell immediately something was up. On the pit wall, surrounded by screens showing the car's race data and video replays, he watched the incident over and over. Turn 17 wasn't a particularly challenging corner. Rob knew a driver of Nelson's caliber shouldn't crash there, particularly in such a dramatic way. The way the car spun, the aggressive acceleration just before the accident, it didn't look like a mistake. Nevertheless, for now, the result stood. In the days after the race, the anxious Renault team heard whispers that the head of the Formula One group, Bernie Ecclestone, had been told about the deliberate crash. And so, Nelson, assuming that the gig was up, anxiously waited for the call that would end his career. Days passed, then a week, then a month, and nothing happened. Before the team knew it, the season was over, and the championship results were locked in. Felipe Massa lost the 2008 World Championship to Lewis Hamilton by a single heartbreaking point at the final race of the season in his home country of Brazil. At the time, an FIA rule stated that a World Championship classification was untouchable after the official prize-giving ceremony at the end of the year, and so Briatore breathed a sigh of relief and celebrated. Renault hadn't won the championship, but the team had been saved. The success in Singapore brought in prize money, satisfied sponsors, and secured Briatore in his position of power. And with this success, Nelson's contract was also renewed for another season. But for him, it didn't feel like success. Nelson had a hard time reconciling what he'd done, and his mental health suffered as a result. His performances in the 2009 season were even worse than they were the year before, and after 10 races without scoring a single point, Briatore kicked Nelson out of the team mid-season and replaced him with rookie Romain Grosjean. After this final betrayal, with nothing else to lose, Nelson finally went to his father and confessed everything. At first, Nelson dreaded the shame of his father finally finding out the truth, but when he finally told him, his dad wasn't disappointed like Junior thought he might be. As he heard about the coercion, the threats, and the manipulation by Briatore and Simmons, it lit a fire under Nelson Piquet Sr. These sick people had forced his son to purposely endanger his life and career for the sake of what? Their brittle egos and some sponsorship money? Nelson Sr. was determined to make the two of them pay for what they had done to his son, and so he outlined a plan for his son to go public with the truth. However, Nelson Jr. wasn't so sure. Briatore had threatened legal action against him if he were to ever tell officials what really happened. But his dad reassured him, telling him, "Let them go ahead. I have the money to afford the best lawyers." And against what he wants to complain about? Against the truth? And with that, on July 29th, 2009, just 2 days before his dismissal was made public, Nelson Piquet Jr. signed a 1,400-word statement. The document, which was later leaked online, provided a devastatingly detailed account of the conspiracy, naming Flavio Briatore and Pat Simmons as the architects of the plan. The FIA launched a comprehensive investigation, interviewing all parties involved. Briatore, Simmons, and even Alonso were interrogated. And then, on September 16, 2009, just 5 days before their scheduled hearing with the World Motorsport Council, Renault announced that they would not contest the charges. Both Flavio Briatore and Pat Simmons had been removed from the team, effective immediately. Initially, the punishments were severe. Briatore was banned from all FIA-sanctioned events for life, and Simmons was banned for 5 years. However, in a French court, both Briatore and Simmons later had their bans overturned. Fernando Alonso was cleared of any involvement, claiming he'd been completely unaware of the conspiracy. It was later revealed that the highest authorities in the sport, Bernie Ecclestone and FIA President Max Mosley, had indeed known about the deliberate crash much earlier, shortly after it happened, in fact, but they had made a conscious decision to cover it up. Their reason? They wanted to protect the sport and save it from a huge scandal. I guess that didn't work.